Picture this, in ancient Athens. If they wanted a new leader, they literally just pulled names out of a giant lottery machine. Crazy, right? Today our systems are vastly more complex, but we have to ask ourselves, are they actually working? Welcome everyone to today's Explainer. Think of this as a university-style masterclass, where we're going to rigorously explore the state of global governance. Over the next few minutes, we're taking an objective, entirely data-driven look at a massive shift happening right under our feet, a 20-year global recession of fundamental democratic rights.
So I want to kick things off by posing a really fundamental question directly to you. Is democracy actually surviving its modern stress test? I mean, we all learn the theoretical ideals of democratic systems in school, but we have to ask ourselves whether those ideals are truly holding up against contemporary institutional failures and the incredibly intense pressures of the 21st century.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our syllabus for today's Explainer. We'll start with ideals versus empirical reality, then look at 2 decades of decline, the assault on expression, eroding due process, the cosmopolitan challenge, and finally, reversing the democratic recession. Let's get to it.
To really grasp the current crisis, we got to understand the baseline. In ancient Athens, the ideal of democracy meant direct, active citizen service to the community. But obviously, modern populations are massive, and today's issues are highly complex. So our modern systems are indirect. We rely heavily on constitutional limits where majority rule is carefully, legally balanced by robust protections from minority rights. The absolute primary goal of modern constitutionalism is limited government and the rule of law, essentially doing whatever it takes to prevent the tyranny of either the elite or the majority.
And this brings us to a massive theoretical debates. The predominant model today is representative democracy, where we delegate our sovereignty to elected officials. But this faces what political scientists call the Schumperian critique. Economist Joseph Schumpeter argued that representative elections often merely serve as a mechanism to swap out competing elites who manipulate public opinion rather than realizing true popular sovereignty. Kind of a bummer, right? In stark contrast, participatory and deliberative models demand active, reasoned, and continuous citizen involvement, like participatory budgeting, for example, to cultivate a much clearer understanding of common interests. Think about your own local elections for a second. Do you feel like a sovereign citizen making a difference or just a spectator swapping out elites?
But how do all these high-minded theories hold up out in the real world? Well, let's pivot to the empirical reality. And brace yourselves, because according to comprehensive data from Freedom House, global freedom has now declined for the 20th consecutive year. 2 solid decades.
So, the crucial point here is that this is not just an isolated hiccup in 1 or 2 nations. Looking at the global trajectory for 2025, researchers found that 54 countries experienced a deterioration in democratic conditions, while only 35 marked an improvement. This is a widespread, systemic phenomenon recorded across the board by international researchers from Freedom House and the VDEM Institute.
When we actually break down the numbers on that 20-year decline, a pretty chilling pattern emerges. While the outward facade of competitive elections often remains perfectly in place, the structural pillars that make a democracy actually functional are hollowing out from the inside. Global scores for media freedom have fallen by 15%, freedom of personal expression has plummeted by 17%, and the right to due process has dropped by 15%. Why does this matter to us? Because these aren't just abstract numbers on a chart. They represent independent journalists being silenced, political opposition erased, and everyday citizens systematically losing their voice.
Which brings us to Section 1, the assault on expression, focusing on digital surveillance and media capture.
Okay, so a functioning democracy absolutely relies on an informed public, but what we're seeing now is the rapid rise of highly sophisticated digital surveillance used to completely suffocate that flow of independent information. Authoritarian regimes are developing incredibly draconian methods to monitor and silence critics both online and offline. For example, in China, censorship efforts have severely intensified with technologically advanced restrictions on internet content. Similarly, Iranian authorities have responded to successive pro-democracy protests with total, sweeping internet blackouts, deploying technology to crush dissent and totally chill public discussion.
Now, what's really interesting here is that autocrats rarely start off by just outright banning elections. Looking at the VDEM data, government censorship efforts and the harassment of journalists are the absolute leading indicators of a nation sliding into autocracy. Actually, roughly 75% of autocraticizing leaders actively work to silence independent media. Almost universally, it is their very first target.
And look, this isn't just happening in closed dictatorships. It creeps up gradually in electoral systems too. Take Hungary as an empirical case study. The data shows a massive 28-point score decline on Freedom House's index over the last 20 years. This wasn't some overnight military coup. It was driven by freely elected leaders applying tight regulatory control, deliberately withholding public advertising funds from critical news outlets, and overseeing the acquisition of independent media, like Hungary's most popular tabloid, by pro-government allies. It's a textbook way of effectively centralizing the information space.
Moving right along to Section 2, eroding due process, or the politicization of justice. So what exactly happens when courts and police forces are transformed from impartial arbiters of the law into highly politicized weapons against dissent? Let's look at the empirical findings out of Turkey. Over the last decade, following constitutional overhauls and a failed coup attempt, the government basically reassigned thousands of police officers, judges, and prosecutors. The result has been a massive surge of charges based on secret testimony and the incredibly lengthy pre-trial detention of political opponents, journalists, and activists. It's severely compromised the fundamental right to a fair trial.
And we're seeing these exact same demands for justice all over the globe. The trend is entirely borderless, from citizens protesting in Nicaragua straight across to the streets of Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, the imposition of the 2020 national security law contained features that were highly detrimental to due process, including closed trials and really vague charges of collusion. This led directly to arbitrary arrests and literally decades-long sentences for pro-democracy advocates and media owners. It perfectly illustrates a systemic, global wave of sidelining political dissidents right through the criminal justice system.
This trend of institutional strain definitely extends to established liberal democracies as well. According to recent VDEM reports, the United States has registered unprecedented democratic deterioration. The data documents specific strains, including the politicization of the Justice Department, the nullification of diversity initiatives across federal programs, the suppression of dissenting voices during protests, and aggressive rhetoric stamping the media as enemies of the people. It's a stark reminder that constitutional guardrails can be tested absolutely anywhere.
Next up is Section 3, the Cosmopolitan Challenge, looking at democracy beyond borders.
Okay, so if our institutions are straining internally, how do they hold up against massive external forces that completely ignore borders? This introduces the cosmopolitan model of democracy, which is championed by theorist David Helt. The core argument here is that in our highly interconnected world, concentrated global economic and technological power is seriously undermining traditional, state-bound democratic assumptions. Basically, if decisions made half a world away profoundly affect citizens at home, then a democracy confined strictly to the nation-state might literally be losing its practical grip on sovereignty.
And this brilliantly illustrates why theorists are calling for a massive rethink in how we view governance. Just look at these transnational threats: climate change, global financial flows, pandemics, and borderless digital disinformation. None of these things respect national borders. After all, a climate disaster or a global financial crash doesn't exactly stop to ask for your passport or check your local voting records, right? So cosmopolitan theory proposes a multi-layered system of global governance, operating locally, nationally, and globally to actually hold these giant borderless forces democratically accountable.
Finally, we arrive at Section 4, reversing the democratic recession, focusing on real policy in action.
Because understanding the theory and the data, that's really only half the battle. Restoring this balance isn't about some magic quick fix. It requires a comprehensive ecosystem approach. Following frameworks from researchers like the UN Development Program, safeguarding electoral integrity has to sit at the center. But it absolutely must be supported by reinforcing institutional checks and balances, restraining the influence of massive economic power, and completely revitalizing our information ecosystem so that public deliberation is based on actual facts, not algorithmically driven manipulation.
Researchers and policy experts have actually outlined specific, actionable steps to channel all this political conflict into constructive debate. First, governments must counter transnational repression by rigorously vetting international extradition requests from autocracies. Second, we've got to mitigate algorithmic polarization, meaning enforcing strict systemic risk audits on those massive online platforms that are designed to prioritize outrage. And third, democracy should institutionalize deliberative innovations. Think of things like permanent citizens' assemblies to actively integrate ordinary people right into long-term policymaking. Ultimately, reversing a 20-year decline requires collective, dedicated action to protect the front lines. Democratic governments, philanthropists, and the private sector really need to reimagine how they fund civil society. We need targeted assistance to support independent and exiled media, technical and financial aid for human rights lawyers working in incredibly restrictive settings, and a rigorous, relentless defense of personal expression and due process both at home and abroad.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final provocation, something to really deeply consider. If our fundamental rights, our personal expression, our independent media, our due process, are being eroded not just by domestic leaders, but by borderless digital algorithms and massive global forces, is simply participating in local representative elections actually enough to save them? Or does our civic participation need a radical, fundamental evolution for the modern era? Thank you so much for joining me for this analysis today, and keep asking the hard questions.